To clarify,
Yeah.
Donald Trump, independent of any other decision makers, can launch nuclear weapons of his own decision. For example, one bomb at Tehran that has the power of 80 Hiroshima bombs. That's 80 Hiroshimas.
Yeah, that's not a far-fetched scenario at all. Absolutely.
Welcome to the Brad Carr Podcast. My guest is Dr. Ivana Nikolić Hughes, scientific advisor to the United Nations, award-winning faculty member at Columbia University, and president of the NuclearAgePeace Foundation. In this episode, we'll discuss why she believes that the risk of nuclear war in the next 12 months has risen to a 25% chance. To illustrate this 1 in 4 chance, I have 4 slips of paper. One is marked with a black dot. At the end of this episode, I'll put them in a hat and pull one just to see what happens. Dr. Ivana Nikolić Hughes, what do you think is the probability of nuclear war in the next 12 months?
Unfortunately, the answer that I have is that it's too high, much too high. And I want to take us just a step back to the period before even the Ukraine war, which started now over 4 years ago in February of 2022. Prior to that conflict, an expert on these matters, Professor Marty Hellman from Stanford University, had estimated that the probability of nuclear weapons use in any given year was about 1% per year. And he goes through a very sort of careful order of magnitude estimate where he looks at what had happened in sort of the first, let's call it 8 decades of the nuclear age, both in terms of obviously the fact that we have not had actual nuclear use, but the fact that we had come very close to nuclear use on several occasions, some of them through false alarms, some of them could have been deliberate, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so his estimate is that he says, look, it's not 10% per year, because 10% per year, by now we would have blown ourselves up. It's not 0.1% per year, because again, so many of these things got us very, very close to nuclear exchange and possibly nuclear war. And so he lands on 1% per year. And then after Ukraine happened, he said this must have gone up several-fold, in fact, with the Ukraine war. And now with this war on Iran that the U.S. and Israel started about, 6 weeks ago. I think the dangers are alarmingly high. And in some sense, the reason this is so different even from Ukraine, where President Putin, one could say, had been issuing nuclear threats, but those threats were always used in a way that, if Russia feels threatened enough, if Russia's sort of the very existence of the state were threatened, Russia would resort to using nuclear weapons. That's even sort of part of their nuclear doctrine. What we're looking at, just over the last couple of weeks, right, with President Trump's threats, he's repeatedly said that he wants to bomb Iran into the Stone Age. He, just several days ago, basically said a whole civilization will die tonight. This kind of rhetoric really is something that we're seeing for the very first time in the nuclear age. And again, it's not like we've been, we developed nuclear weapons 80 years ago and things have gone swimmingly. They've been quite rough for, on so many occasions during the Cold War, but then again, since the end of the Cold War as well, and most particularly in the last several years. But this is quite a new terrain. So let me say a little bit about what's so different and kind of disturbing about this war. So On the one hand, we have the United States and Israel attacking Iran over Iran's, I would say, capability to build nuclear weapons, not over its existing nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. The United States, of course, is the country that developed nuclear weapons. It's the country that used them in attacks on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities full of women and children. And we can even discuss, why that the narrative surrounding those attacks continues to be that those attacks saved lives. And that's just not true. That's just not supported by historical evidence. And we can talk about that in more detail. The United States also basically I often cite this as wrote the playbook for the nuclear testing era. We have had throughout these decades over 2,000 nuclear explosions. We called them nuclear tests, but there was nothing, sort of experimental about them. They were full-blown nuclear explosions, some thousands of times more powerful than the bombs used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so, the United States sort of bears a very special responsibility in my mind for the nuclear age. Israel, there are 9 countries that possess nuclear weapons. Israel is one of them, but Israel is in a category all of its own in that it has this policy of ambiguity, doesn't declare that it has a nuclear arsenal. There's perhaps the most uncertainty about how large their arsenal is. And so on and so forth. And so these are the 2 states, right, saying Iran can't have nuclear weapons, and so we're going to, as Trump put it, bomb them out of existence. And so what about this war, could precipitate into not just the use of a nuclear weapon, but really a full-blown nuclear war, something along the lines of Annie Jacobson's scenario, where Annie often says it doesn't matter how it starts. In this case, you could imagine President Trump in one of his moments of being unhinged, deciding to drop a nuclear weapon, and it's not going to be like a pilot's going to drop it off a plane. It's going to be an intercontinental ballistic missile or a submarine launched missile, which could get even much closer. It could be literally, a few minutes before it hits, for example, Tehran. It could be deliberate. It could be that Israel decides that and there have been voices in Israel calling for the use of nuclear weapons, and even justifications along the lines of, attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki saved lives, so we might save lives here if we use a nuclear weapon, which is absolutely preposterous. So it could be deliberate, and at the same time, it could also happen because someone thinks they're under attack. There's some kind of a miscalculation. There's some kind of a false alarm. There's some kind of a cyber attack. You can make it look like you're under attack. And we, the United States, have this launch on warning policy. And if we think we're under attack, we're going to attack. Now, I think it's really important to think through, if such a deliberate or accidental attack, let's say, occurs on Tehran, what are Russia and China going to think? Are they going to think they're next? Are they going to want to use nuclear weapons before they're attacked? I think we just quite simply don't know. And in some sense, it feels like the number of players and kind of the number of nuclear armed possessors engaged here directly or indirectly is really just makes this incredibly, incredibly dangerous. Now, Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, but there have been some really excellent analysis. Professor Ted Postel from MIT has been talking about this, that in fact they have enough highly enriched uranium to, within a couple of weeks, put together several, maybe up to 10 Hiroshima-sized bombs. And if that were to happen, so let's say that Iran gets attacked with a nuclear weapon. Iran is a very large country. There have been these maps of like how much of the United States, like the map of Iran superimposed on the United States. It's a large country. I forget, 1.6 million square kilometers, something along those lines. That's a very, very large area. You're not going to bomb, you're not going to obliterate all of Iran, right? So maybe you attack and you have some attacks. The chances that those attacks destroy all of Iran's highly enriched uranium are very small. And so they could then proceed with building these weapons and attack Israel in turn. And Israel is a very small country. And so, to me, all of this just seems, the sheer possession of nuclear weapons has been, insane and having these policies and so on. But now we're quite literally playing with fire. And so, I don't have a perfect answer for you on, 25% or 15% or at some level, I don't even think it matters. It is far too high for any comfort. The probability that a nuclear weapon gets used, and then furthermore, the probability that leads into a nuclear war, where we quite simply end human civilization and possibly life on the planet. The consequences, we think we understand quite a bit of it, but of course, it would be so serious that kind of, really thinking of the end game, what does that mean for the human species? I think that part is difficult, but it's not good. It's not, it's not promising.
Yeah. So even we have Martin Hellman's number at 1%, and 1%. That was before Ukraine.
That was before Ukraine.
So this is an order of magnitude sort of an estimation. He said it's not 10%, but it's 1%. Now we know that the risk is higher since Ukraine and now Israel, Iran, everything else. So we're looking at much more than 1%.
Yeah. I think if I were to just give you a number, my own estimate would be that probably went up to 5% with Ukraine war and another 5-fold to 25% with this war. But what's really important about these numbers is that this is cumulative, right? So this is 1% per year. And if you play this out and you say, if the probability is 1% every year, what that actually means is that the probability of it not happening is 99%. That's pretty good, right? We might even feel okay with that, right? But now, if you think about, for example, the period of the next 10 years, what is the probability that 99% times 99% times 99% over a period of 10 years, that's going to now, that's the probability that it doesn't happen for the next 10 years. If we do that for a period of 80 years, the probability that it doesn't happen rises to almost 50%. That means that the probability that it happens at least once in all those years is over 50%. So if we're looking at 25% per year and this war continues, we're just going to blow ourselves up. This is not going to end well, at all, because the longer you keep these things going, the higher the chance that they actually materialize. This is like if you play, Russian roulette and you have some chance, 1 in 6 of, having the bullet, that's, really high, but it doesn't really matter because if you keep playing, even if you have a whole bunch of even if your probability in Russian roulette is 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, but you just keep playing, you will eventually actually, that outcome will materialize. So the whole point is that the longer we play this game of having nuclear weapons and moreover having conflicts involving states that have nuclear weapons, the higher the chance and the closer we will get to the ultimate outcome, which is the idea that we're somehow going to get, to have humanity, continue on indefinitely in a world with nuclear weapons is just a false idea. Like it's something will happen, and again, as Annie Jacobson points out, it doesn't matter how it starts; it's going to end up in a full-blown nuclear war.
Mm-hmm. So even the conflicts with nuclear powers involved, by getting into things with Russia and Ukraine, we increase fivefold from 1% to 5%. Now having another conflict, U.S., Israel, all of that, doesn't take us from 5% to 10%. It doesn't add another 5%. It multiplies 5% times 5 again.
That would be my personal estimate. I have not actually heard any experts discussing specific numbers on this, how much higher we have gone with this conflict. I just feel like this conflict has even more of a chance of pushing us into a nuclear exchange, which we then really don't know, how that ends, because it is a more complex conflict. One of the, I think, nice things that we've seen is Pakistan emerging as a, in leading negotiations, in leading sort of the diplomatic effort to end the war. Pakistan and India, they both have nuclear weapons, far smaller arsenals than the United States and Russia, but still arsenals big enough, about 150 nuclear warheads each. Their warheads are estimated to maybe be, several times more powerful than the bombs used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Estimates show that in what's referred to as a limited regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan, the estimates show about 130 million people die. So this is attacks on major cities in India and Pakistan. Both populous countries. Of course, India is the most populous country in the world. But then what ensues afterwards is this nuclear winter that then kills over 2 billion people around the globe, because the fires from the conflict. So one of the things about nuclear weapons is they literally create miniature suns on Earth, right? So these fireballs created by nuclear weapon, this is not like, the images that we've been seeing from Gaza and elsewhere in Tehran and Lebanon and so on of, boom, and a building is destroyed, but that's it, right? Like we see a single building and that's it. What nuclear weapons create is so much energy, much of which goes into this heat. The temperatures are as hot as the sun. And so this now literally begins to burn everything that could possibly, initially in the initial fireball radius, you just have everything is vaporized. But beyond that, you now begin to burn things, and there's so much fire and so much soot that goes into the atmosphere. This blocks incoming sunlight, and then temperatures begin to drop. And that kind of an impact lasts for, let's say, a decade. But the temperature drop is so severe, and because India and Pakistan, especially where they're located, their impact on the global climate would be enormous. And so the temperature drop is, I don't know, for that particular scenario, maybe between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius. And so what that means is that much of the Earth becomes much colder, and actually so cold that food can't grow, plants can't grow, food can't grow, agriculture begins to fail, and we sort of people around the world begin to starve. So it wouldn't matter that in that case, it wouldn't be like people would be dying in cities across North America and Russia and China and Europe. We would still, all be impacted. That's nuclear winter is one of these enormous environmental impacts. The spread of radiation is another. Ozone layer destruction is another. So these are all very, very serious global environmental impacts that we quite simply, um, I just always think of it as people need to understand what's at stake. Like, this isn't just another Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were tragic enough, but that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at something much, much more serious.
Yes, the stakes of a nuclear war seem distinctly different than conflict with any other kind of weapon. It seems to call them weapons is almost a misnomer. They're more like some sort of mutual suicide handcuff that if you have them and then you start to say, well, we will use them if other people attack us, or if we're in danger, then everybody kind of gets into a suicide pact. What do you think really is the meaning of possessing nuclear weapons?
So let me respond to throughout the Cold War, we had this notion of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, and that was somehow supposed to keep everybody in check. One underlying assumption for MAD is that the leaders behave rationally at all times. And of course, we know that that's not true. Even if you just look at something like, President Trump doesn't seem to have a drinking problem, but he seems to have some other problems. As far as I'm concerned, I'm sorry to say, even when he was in office from 2016 to 2020, and even when he started last year, I just have always, in some sense, had I think too much respect for both that office, whether or not it deserves it, but also for the American people, whether or not I agreed with the choice. I just had respect for the decision made by the American people to elect someone. And I've really just lost all sense of being careful about not criticizing him. I think this is really, what we're witnessing now is really truly unprecedented. But the point I wanted to make is that, other leaders, we know Boris Yeltsin had, the nuclear codes and had a real drinking problem. So did Richard Nixon, especially towards the end of his presidency. There were times when his, Secretary of State Kissinger, out of all people, were like, oh, if the president orders a nuclear strike, check with me. And it's not even clear that people would have, because that wasn't standard procedure. That wasn't policy. So this assumption that leaders are going to always be rational is in and of itself enough to kind of give us pause about this whole thing. But I think even more importantly, I would say that the notion of mutually assured destruction, whatever you think, however patriotic you are, and I'm an American, I'm actually a naturalized citizen. I came to this country as a foreign exchange student. I stayed for school. I had some of the really just the most incredible, I'm literally tearing up just saying these words, opportunities here, to study, to work in science, to, be at some of the world's best universities. And I'm so grateful for all of that. And I'm so proud to be an American. But even if you sort of in this whole thing accept, like, okay, well, if we could win a nuclear war, right? Like if we could just wipe out Russia or China or whomever, that would be a good thing, wouldn't it? And let's even assume that that's somehow possible, that we could disable their, we could do some sort of cyber attack on their command and control systems, that we would have to use so many nuclear weapons to, destroy their cities and kill their people and whatever that would even mean, that we would create environmental conditions that would kill us, right?
Yeah.
So the mutually assured destruction was actually always self-assured destruction. And I'm disregarding, I'm saying some really immoral, horrible things, right? But even if you could, it was never possible. So the whole thing, I really see so much of this and so much of the policies that are embedded in these nuclear doctrines. I see it through, and I'll quote two different people. One is the late Pope Francis, who called the mere possession of nuclear weapons immoral. And so that was really the first time that the Catholic Church, which had been involved in these conversations for decades, both at kind of the highest levels, but also at the level of the kind of grassroots levels. It was the Catholic Church had kind of accepted nuclear deterrence, the nuclear deterrence doctrine. And then Pope Francis came out and then said, actually, no, the mere possession of these weapons is immoral. Another quote that I really love comes from the late Dan Ellsberg, who had released in the early 1970s the Pentagon Papers, and then really went on to advocate for nuclear disarmament, to advocate for, not just, for peace, for end of the Cold War, all these things, but really with a focus on the nuclear weapons problem. He called both past and current nuclear weapons policies, this is from his book, The Doomsday Machine, he called them dizzyingly insane and immoral. And that's really, to me, that's like the full description of what it is that we're discussing here. That we're discussing, and again, I know you discussed this with Annie, in a mere 72 minutes, destroying human civilization and literally making hell on earth is just unfathomable to me. I think about this all the time, and I still think, like, how is it possible that we're even having this conversation? How is it possible that we've gotten ourselves to this point? And so we, I guess what I'm saying is leading me to kind of say something about, like, we just need to raise this public awareness to levels that were present in, I would say, the 60s and the 80s, which were the times when we actually had some progress on these issues. When average people were aware of this threat, understood this threat, spoke about it, marched in Central Park, on June 12th of 1982. 1 million people marched from all around the United States, came to New York and marched in Central Park against the nuclear arms race. And we just somehow need to get back to first the awareness, and then the kind of activism that says enough is enough. You cannot threaten to destroy our world. For what? Because we don't like Russia, or we don't like China, or we don't like Iran, or we don't like, any player that you can that you can, and you can justify not liking for whatever reason. Is that really, like, worth destroying human civilization and possibly the planet in terms of it being able to host life.
Mm-hmm. Even I think you've hit on something that a lot of people might not recognize, which is that mutually assured destruction was already there in the threat of using these weapons. Even if you can win, you still ensure your own destruction. So it seems there is a no-win scenario regardless of the technical aspect. If, say, the U.S. no longer had nuclear weapons and then Russia was to destroy the United States with nuclear weapons, Russia would also precipitate its own destruction?
Pretty much, yes, pretty much. I think people often ask me, so one of the things that I work on is at the United Nations, we have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. This is basically the latest, the newest nuclear disarmament treaty. It is mostly a global South treaty. It's being led by countries that don't have nuclear weapons, who are again saying enough is enough, and you've put us under enough risk. And I often get this question, like, "Oh, but what if you even succeed and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons meets its goal of eliminating all nuclear arsenals, and then someone cheats, right?"
Mm-hmm.
So right now, we have 12,500 nuclear weapons, most of which are far more powerful, some in the, tens of times or hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. China has relative to the United States and Russia, has about 10% of the U.S. or Russia's arsenals in terms of the number, but has, to my knowledge, some of the most powerful weapons. So they have weapons with energy yields up to 5 megatons. That's the equivalent of 5 million tons of TNT. Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons, so 15,000 tons. So this is on the order of 330, times more powerful. So 330 Hiroshima bomb equivalents. They don't have just one of those, right? They obviously have, they probably have dozens of those. So we're talking about just such an enormous, possibility of destruction and murder and killing that it doesn't really come. I mean, going back to your earlier point, a much earlier question of calling them weapons is almost a misnomer itself. I've also talked about the way in which they differ from other types of weapons, both in the sense that they can impact things over very long periods of time through obviously things like nuclear winter, but also radiation and so on, but also have global impacts. When you have these explosions, right, you're not just impacting, you're not just destroying one building or even just one city. Yes, Hiroshima and Nagasaki destroyed those cities and those cities came back, but those bombs were baby bombs compared to the ones we have today. Tucker Carlson actually recently, in, I believe maybe it was a monologue, talked about Trump's threats to use nuclear weapons on Iran, and said he's threatening to use weapons that we've never used before. And he's right. We have never used the weapons that we have today. Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were very different. Even the physical process, Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were what we call atomic bombs or fission weapons. They're either made of uranium or plutonium. It's about splitting the nucleus of an atom and producing energy that way. All 9 nuclear-armed possessors have hydrogen bombs, which use a different physical process. It's actually the physical process that takes place in the sun, inside the sun, where hydrogen isotopes the elements nuclei of hydrogen come together to form helium and release energy that way. Clearly works pretty well for stars, right? But it's, again, creating these miniature stars on Earth. And not only are these much more powerful bombs, again, than the ones in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it wouldn't be Captain Paul Tibbets, flying an airplane and making a visual, target and dropping it, from a plane. It would be some kind of intercontinental ballistic missile or submarine launched missile, something that would arrive in a matter of minutes. And then once you press that button, you can't recall, right? Like you can't get it back. If you have someone taking a nuclear weapon, not that, in 1945, they sort of had this permission to, once a bomb was ready, like they had sort of a blank check to take it to one from a list of cities, Japanese cities. But you could, you could recall something. Once you're using these missiles, you can't recall them.
Mm-hmm. So even it seems that the logic of possessing nuclear weapons is something like, we need them because other countries have them. And if we don't, that they can attack us and then we could lose. But it seems that if they attack us, we're going to lose and they're going to lose because, we're trading partners, we have allies who have them. Like, it's just going to be a mess for everyone and kill billions of people in the starvation and everything that comes after. So it just seems like a logic of suicide. And I wonder, are you familiar, you're at Columbia, are you familiar with Dr. Raghi Girgis and his work on mass shootings?
No, I'm not.
So it gets into something that I see a parallel with here, which is that when someone commits a mass shooting, often the profile of that person, and Raghi Girgis is a psychiatrist, the profile of that person is that they're actually extremely nihilistic, extremely narcissistic, and they're ready to die. So what they actually want is to go into a place where people are armed, so that they can be met with violence. They don't actually want to just knock people off and kill as many people as possible. Otherwise, they would poison or something like that. But instead, they're going and looking for this fight. It seems that the logic of nuclear weapons is similar. It's like, to use them, you would have to want to die. Is there a better use for them? Is there a better logic to possessing them?
Well, the logic that's being used all the time, and I think Trump is really shattering some of this, is this notion we only have them, to deter attacks from others. I disagree with all of this logic, and I can explain further why I do. But even if you accepted, for example, that the only reason to have nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear weapon attack from someone else, then you could actually implement something called a no first use policy. And that is quite simply something that the U.S. has never done. There are two countries currently that have that policy. China has had that policy ever since they acquired nuclear weapons in the 60s. And India also has that policy. It doesn't mean that those nuclear arsenals aren't subject to, to potential use. For one, I would say that, as long as you have them, you could change your policy. I mean, that's kind of a simple one. And two, if you have a policy where you think you're under attack, you might use them. You might even use them first, as well. So there's a real, there's a lot of illogical things about this nuclear deterrence. I want to get a little bit into the false alarms and all the times that we actually could have had nuclear war, or some kind of nuclear exchange, accidents and so on. But before I do that, I just want to address what I think is a really fundamental issue about nuclear war itself. And I think for a long time, both leaders and the general public actually understood this and internalized this. I think we're now getting to a point where some leaders are talking about this as if it were just any kind of war that you can win or lose. So in 1985, in Geneva, President Reagan and his Soviet counterpart, Mikhail Gorbachev, issued a joint statement saying nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And that really, I mean, we're now like 40 years after that statement, and here we are, talking about winning a nuclear war. Just to add one more thing before I talk about the accidents and false alarms. So if we accept this notion of nuclear deterrence, right, being the reason to have nuclear weapons, we don't need thousands of them. Nobody needs thousands of them, right? If you really have, so one thing you could do is if you had everybody say we have a no first use policy, that would be one thing. That nobody's threatening to attack someone else, including states that don't actually have nuclear weapons, right? But in all of these cases, if your sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter attacks by others, what you really need, and, some people put the number at 100, some people say, some people even say, really all you need is 10 nuclear warheads. That would be a very different world. If we lived in a world in which several states have 10 nuclear warheads each, or even 100 is a little too much for me, but even 100, first of all, those weapons would be much, under much more control than currently you've got these thousands, right? Like just even logistically, it would be. And then secondly, we wouldn't actually be in the situation where we're thinking about the fact that not only are you going to lose a lot of cities, you're also going to precipitate these environmental changes that destroy the planet. So if nuclear deterrence were really the reason to have these weapons, then a far smaller number would make a lot more sense. And the onus for this far smaller number is really currently on the United States and Russia. Those are, I've said already, 9 states possess about 12,500 nuclear warheads. The U.S. and Russia both have over 5,000, on the order of, call it 5,500 each. China has increased its arsenal in recent years. They're estimated to be at about 600 nuclear warheads, and everyone else pretty much has a couple hundred, 250, 300, the UK and France. France is now talking about increasing the size of its arsenal. It's also offering its nuclear umbrella to, European partners, which is so dangerous in and of itself. Like people just need to look at a globe and look at Europe, and Europe is so tiny. Like nuclear war would quite simply wipe out Europe. Russia is so large geographically. The US is also kind of isolated, and so on. You could imagine pockets of humanity living, surviving in parts of, but Europe, I just think would like it would just all look like Hiroshima, and Nagasaki would be really, really terrible. So the deterrence has a lot of problems. It has problems that we are, human beings, and again, banking on leaders being rational is a really, tall order. But we also know from history that we've had a lot of accidents, and we've had false alarms, and we've had moments of conflict. And now I don't even need to remind everyone. It's like President Trump's been, last week, a week ago, I was sick all day on Tuesday, which was, when he said a whole civilization will die tonight. And then the ceasefire was announced and gave us at least a breather for a moment. We don't know what would happen if President Trump decided to drop a nuclear weapon on Iran, what sort of the cascade would look like. But let me discuss a few of these accident, false alarms, miscalculations, historical examples.
Ivana, I'm sorry to interrupt, but before you do that, could we just go a little bit deeper on what you're noticing with President Trump? Because you mentioned earlier, that he seems unhinged. I understand from talking with Annie and reading her book that he has presidential authority to launch a counterattack. Now, can he, independent of everyone, also launch when not attacked?
He can absolutely launch nuclear weapons and he could decide to just use one nuclear warhead, something like 1.2 megatons, about 80 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. He could decide to use that on Tehran. Absolutely. He has that authority. This is actually a really interesting question in terms of historically, how did we get to a point where the president is the person who solely decides? And I was investigating this. I was in LA to speak on a panel after a play and was looking up all this stuff from history about the decision to drop the bomb in 1945. And basically, there was no single decision. It wasn't like Truman said, okay, go ahead, attack Hiroshima. It was that there was a memo from General Groves, who was the military leader of the Manhattan Project. The memo basically said, this bomb, we'll have the first bomb ready by this, by this date, and we'll have the next bomb ready by this date. And here's our list of cities, and we'll try to, and they sort of had this permission, and Truman had implicitly just given that permission. At that same time, there were, scientists who were trying to say that this shouldn't be done and so on, but Truman just went ahead with it. And I think what's interesting is after that basic permission to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was another memo from Groves that was discussing subsequent nuclear weapons explosions or subsequent attacks. And it was at the bottom of that memo that the chief of staff of Truman, George Mitchell, had actually written, not to be dropped without the express authority by the president. And that's really the origin of this sole authority that the president, this was never discussed, debated, passed by, there was never any sort of legislation by Congress, never any discussion about who has the permission and under what circumstances. It just kind of became a de facto policy that the president would have the ability to drop the bomb.
So to clarify, Donald Trump, independent of any other decision makers, can launch nuclear weapons of his own decision. For example, one bomb at Tehran that has the power of 80 Hiroshima bombs. That's 80 Hiroshimas.
Yeah, that's not a far-fetched scenario at all. Absolutely. Okay. And I think I've actually written about this with a colleague of mine from American University, Peter Kuznick. We wrote about Trump breaking the nuclear taboo because part of what we've been seeing is President Trump breaking international law, on repeat. And this would be almost if your sort of feeling of, being drunk with power and, these kind of grandiose thoughts of leadership, are, driving your policy decisions, then, using a nuclear weapon would be almost the ultimate expression of that kind of power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In any scenario, she talks about the Mad King being North Korea. What do you think of the Mad King as it applies to Donald Trump?
I think he's acting as a Mad King right now. I mean, I think what he's done with Iran and the attack on Iran has been not just dangerous, but it's lacked any kind of strategy. I think the mad part is the fact that he doesn't even seem to know what his goals are. And I think, even last year during the 12-day war on Iran, I was talking about how much more could have been achieved just by keeping the JCPOA, which had been negotiated, and had been in place, and then Trump walked away from it. And none of the goals of, curtailing the Iranian nuclear weapons program, none of the goals have really been achieved last June or now. And in fact, we've sort of emboldened Iran in a sense, given them this, economic power that they are now exercising over the Strait of Hormuz and so on. So I really do worry that Trump has kind of entered this Mad King territory. And once you're in it, it also seems really hard to get out of it. Although, I've also heard an analysis, this was, I think, by Yanis Varoufakis, who said, well, the Roman emperors, used to send their armies, they'd get all beat up, and then they'd bring them back and declare victory. So maybe Trump can declare victory and just stop the war. Because it's not helping the United States, it's not helping the world. It's not helping the people in this country who need, our tax dollars to go towards social programs and not towards actually killing people in other parts of the world.
Yes. So Ivana, you wanted to get into close calls, just to kind of tie together what we've got so far. So in the beginning, we talked about the chances and how that is elevated from a 1% chance maybe to a 5% chance when things started in Ukraine, maybe again fivefold to maybe a 25% chance now. In the US, we have a president who acts as a Mad King and has the ability of his own authority, when he feels like it, to launch nuclear weapons. For example, one bomb at Tehran, the power of 80 Hiroshima bombs. And we have launch on warning doctrine, which means that if there is an accident, a misunderstanding, it doesn't matter. We are going to launch. So what historical context do we have for those close calls that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the simplest level, we have 15 nuclear warheads at the bottom of our oceans. Can you imagine that? 50 nuclear warheads.
I was in the U.S. Navy, and I can I can believe that has happened.
From planes, dropped from submarines, just sitting there. I mean, it's unbelievable. We had a U.S. and the Soviet submarine, crashing into each other, both carrying nuclear warheads, crashing into each other. We had planes carrying nuclear warheads crashing into each other. We had bombs, dropped, one in a backyard in South Carolina and another one, at a on a field in North Carolina. Sometimes I mention one or the other and people go, doesn't she know it wasn't North Carolina, it was South Carolina, or vice versa? It was both. We made sure we got both of them. So that's the simplest kind of level of something goes wrong. And imagine that something like that, I think most of those first of all, we mostly know stuff that's been declassified. So we don't even know like what's been going on, the last couple of decades or so. But hopefully some of that kind of like really sort of technical, hopefully some of that stuff has been minimized. But still, it doesn't give you a lot of comfort. There was like a drop wrench in a nuclear, missile silo that could have triggered, the release of the missile. I mean, those sorts of really kind of idiotic accidents happening. Then there is a kind of second order, second kind of level where you might have something like a false alarm. And this happened in 1983. This happened in the Soviet Union. A Soviet officer received signals for 5 incoming missiles, 5 U.S. missiles incoming to the Soviet Union. He basically looked at what the computer was saying and just thought that if the United States was actually attacking the Soviet Union, they'd do it with a lot more than 5 missiles, and decided not to pass the information to his superior, thus saving the world. The protocol would have called for the Soviet Union immediately to, again, launch on warning. This turned out to be a technical glitch that was just based on the superposition of clouds and satellites. And somehow this gave, and it was later corrected and so on. There was, in that same year, there was a NATO exercise called Able Archer, where they had been doing these kind of nuclear, war exercises. But this time, and the Soviets, I think, were aware of those exercises, but this time they had decided to make the exercise a lot more sort of realistic. So they involved real leaders and they added some other kind of realistic elements to the exercise. And the Soviets thought it was the real thing. And they started putting nuclear weapons on bombers and started being ready to respond. And then somehow the news reached them that this really was just an exercise. So we've had these kinds of different levels of, close calls. The Cuban Missile Crisis was this huge close call. That was 12 days. And that was a kind of a confrontation that both had elements of a possible, deliberate decision by one leader or the other, President John F. Kennedy or his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, deciding to start a nuclear war. But there were incidents throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis of, a U.S. plane going far deep into Soviet territory, up in the north. There was a submarine, Soviet submarine that was already in, the Caribbean, near Cuba. They had nuclear warheads. The U.S. was trying to have a blockade, and so they were basically using depth charges, all about this, to sort of stop the submarine. The submarine, the officers on the submarine had to make a decision about whether or not to actually fire a nuclear warhead. 2 of them wanted to fire a nuclear warhead because they thought they were under real attack. They thought that a nuclear war had already started. And one of them said, no, we're not going to fire. And his name is Vasil Arkhipov. And some people call him and Stanislav Petrov, who was the one involved with the false alarm incident, they call them, the man who saved the world. And it's quite literally so. And again, I think what we're seeing now is this whole other new level with President Trump. Not, other leaders have, in some sense, issued threats, again, throughout the nuclear age. And there was some potential of nuclear weapons being used in various conflicts. But I do think that with Trump, we've reached a kind of new level of brazenness, and just really a kind of lack of even, in some sense, understanding what it is that he's proposing to do, if, such an attack were to be carried out.
So, Ivana, you talked about how in the scenario with the Soviets, that the logic of the U.S. only launching 5 was problematic. It tripped them off. It seemed like something was wrong. Now, that's because there are so many places where the Soviets could launch from that you don't launch just 5 at Russia. You launch the mother lode to try and wipe them out. This is disturbing because it seems that by having more nuclear missiles, you become much more important a target. If you have many, then you need to be attacked with many more. Would there be advantages to having fewer? Is that actually a better strategy for your safety?
Brad, you're really hitting on such an important and consequential question. When it comes to the United States, I actually truly believe that the United States would be much safer in a world free of nuclear weapons. Because try to imagine who's going to attack the United States, whether it's our geography or our conventional military. I mean, we quite literally could be what I've heard Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia refer to. We could be the safest country in the history of humanity. But in a world with nuclear weapons, not only do we have thousands, and so we'd get, our missile silos would be wiped out if someone were to attack us, our cities would be attacked, all these sorts of things. We are vulnerable to Russia, and China, we'll call it peer or near peer adversaries. But we're also vulnerable to North Korea. North Korea has on the order of, let's say, 50 nuclear warheads. And they do now have intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach any part of the United States. Some people are talking about Iran now acquiring the ability to have intercontinental ballistic missiles and then possibly pairing them with nuclear weapons. But the logic, of course, is that if you have a world in which, states are sovereign, in which we follow the UN Charter, in which we, follow Geneva Conventions, all those things, we don't have to invent, how to treat each other. We have all of that written in international law. We just have to do it. And in some sense, I would argue we're more vulnerable than we've ever been. And so that, in some sense, means that our leaders have been failing us, and doing so for decades. And we're more vulnerable than we've ever been, and we also spend more money than we've ever spent. I mean, not only have we been spending on the order of $1 trillion on our military to be, again, totally and completely vulnerable to being wiped out as a nation, we are, President Trump is now increasing that military budget. So we haven't really talked about, how do you end up in a world in which the United States has over 5,000 nuclear warheads, which make it a target? How do you end up with this triad of, we have bombers, we can deliver these nuclear warheads with bombers, with submarine launched missiles, and with intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the intercontinental ballistic missiles, quite simply, are sitting ducks. Like if a nuclear war starts, you have to use them, or because their locations are known, they're just going to get attacked. So, the first thing would be like to get rid of the ICBMs. In fact, we have plans to, modernize them, build new ones, all these things. Instead of doing that, maybe we should invest in some, I don't know, high-speed trains. I have a lot of proposals for social spending. But beyond that, it's not just a waste of money. It's also things that are putting us in danger. And so you're absolutely right. The thousands make us even more vulnerable, and then make this outcome of it's not even catastrophic nuclear war is not even, doing justice to what really this would do to our planet.
Mm-hmm. I wonder about the payoff matrix of all this. There must be somewhere people in power who believe that they're safer with nuclear weapons, but I'm having a hard time necessarily laying all of that out. It seems, let's say we didn't have nuclear weapons, and then other countries are using them as a sort of threat, as a sort of gun to the head to get what they want. But that's already happening every day. So we're kind of already under that pressure. Does mutually assured destruction actually, get us leverage in bargaining, or is it kind of a wash?
Yeah, so I want to say two things on this. I love that you said this is already happening every day. This is what Dan Ellsberg used to say. We do use nuclear weapons every single day. We use them like a robber uses a gun when they point it at your head, and they don't have to pull the trigger to be using the gun to rob you, right? So that implicit threat. When I think and talk about these things, I really don't see, and maybe there are people who work on nuclear disarmament who would disagree with me. I don't see that the United States should just disarm and get rid of all of its nuclear warheads. And again, I'd be happy to talk to someone who believes that would be a completely reasonable scenario. I do think that the United States should lead the world in nuclear disarmament, and that would mean to bring all nuclear armed states to a table using whatever it takes, carrots, sticks, and a genuine commitment really to international law to make sure that we actually, stop being at the mercy of these weapons threatening us, and risking our, risking humanity's very survival, by their existence. I do think that the first step in that kind of a journey is an agreement between the United States and Russia. So again, they have nearly 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. To say to even North Korea with its 50 nuclear warheads, while you have over 100 times more nuclear warheads that they have to disarm, but we're going to keep our 5,000 plus, it's kind of like, it's not going to happen, right? How would these countries possibly disarm? I think you have to, in some sense, understand why any of them have nuclear weapons. The India-Pakistan question is, I think, almost the simplest one. They both seem to have nuclear weapons to respond to, conflict between the two of them. As I said already, India has a no first use policy on nuclear weapons and says that they wouldn't attack Pakistan with nuclear weapons first, but they would respond to a Pakistani nuclear weapons attack. Pakistan says, well, we can't have a no first use policy because, India has a much stronger conventional military and so on. What is it? The root of the conflict between the two is the state of Kashmir, right? The state of this province that they both sort of lay claims to. And, it seems that if you could really resolve that in a, peaceful, durable way with some sort of a sustainable, plan, it seems that, why should they have nuclear weapons, right? Like they shouldn't. Another one is North Korea. North Korea seems to have learned the lesson, whether it was from Iraq. It was from Iraq, in fact, because they started their program shortly thereafter. They withdrew from the NPT right after the onset of the Iraq War. They tested their first nuclear warheads in 2006. And so North Korea basically said that, if we don't want the U.S. to do a regime change, we have to have nuclear weapons. It's not an unreasonable conclusion. The problem is that if everyone feels threatened, if international law is so meaningless, if the UN Charter, is being violated, all the time, as we're seeing now during the Trump presidency, then that's the conclusion countries are going to draw. You will have even more countries wanting to or actually acquiring nuclear warheads. And then we're going to be in a world in which so many states have nuclear warheads. We're going to be in a nuclear conflict before you know it. So that's the danger. United Kingdom and France, I think, are super interesting for me because I don't think that they have nuclear warheads because anyone's about to, at least that's my view. No one's about to, go attack Paris. Again, my view. I think both of them have, they were colonial powers. They were world superpowers. And I think the possession of nuclear weapons for them is a way of maintaining that global superpower status rather than anything having to do with actual security, with actual, strategy and international relations. I think they would do much better to sort of, play a role as diplomats, as negotiators, working with the global South, which, in many ways they bear, in so many cases, so much responsibility for decimating some of the countries in the global South. Like they should turn their, I think in some sense we need to move away from nuclear weapons being this symbol of power to nuclear weapons being to eliminating them and then finding other ways to project power. And I would say, that the projecting power through your ability to bring peace and stability to the world would be a much better way of projecting power than projecting power through your ability to destroy the world. So in some sense, again, one could go through all nine. Obviously, Russia and China see the United States as an adversary. There really ultimately could be some agreement between the nine in whatever stage is needed to eliminate their nuclear weapons. Where we really are in a problem right now is that the U.S. and Russia, the last agreements between them, which was called New START, expired on February 5th of this year. It has not been extended. It has not been replaced. And that, again, is the place to start. They have 5,000 plus nuclear warheads. If they both came down to even, let's say, 1,000 or 500 or 600 each, and then they were, either slightly above China's levels or near China's levels, and then brought China into the conversation, and then you kind of, try to really address what do these countries need in order to get to a number. And then maybe you end up with, everyone having on the order of dozens. Like, I would like a world free of nuclear weapons, but I'm going to be much happier in a world in which several countries have, dozens of weapons as opposed to the many thousands that we have today.
Yes, the scale now is the destruction of virtually all human life. Billions of people would die. If even just bringing down that scale so that humanity could survive would be a step in the right direction. Now, with Israel too, they're not transparent about their nuclear program. What is the logic behind all of that, and what do you make of the idea of the Samson option?
Oh, really good questions. I mean, the history of the Israeli program is really, it's interesting. It's troublesome. The whole idea that they built these weapons, but then kept the whole program and the possession sort of ambiguous and undeclared and so on. They started on this in the 50s. It went into the 60s. According to some records, they had their very first bomb by end of 1966. Some people say 1967. It's actually interesting because in the early 60s, once he became president, John F. Kennedy was very disturbed by proliferation of nuclear weapons in general. And so he really wanted to see not to have Israel acquire nuclear weapons because he saw them as a great ally, and he thought, if we can't prevent a great ally from acquiring nuclear weapons, how are we going to, prevent others with whom we might not have friendly relations? So Israel has, we also have national laws where we're not supposed to provide military aid to countries that are not party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But obviously, we provide military aid to Israel, which is not party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the whole thing is kind of, and the logic there is, we don't know that Israel has nuclear weapons. Of course we know that Israel has nuclear weapons.
Oh, that's the workaround?
Well,
the ambiguity of Israel's program?
That's some of it. I think I can't say that that's the cause, but that's definitely part of this conversation, right? Like, we actually are not supposed to give anybody military aid unless they're party to this treaty, which we, in many ways, originated. The treaty actually originated with Kennedy's ideas. This was his, in 63, when he gave this amazing speech at American University, the commencement address in June of 1963, he talked about, a world in which 15 or 20 or 25 states possess nuclear weapons, and how we would just blow up in no time in such a world. And he really, really cared about, non-proliferation. And then Israel never joined. India and Pakistan never joined either. But again, they sort of have this more localized thing. And then North Korea was party to the treaty and then left it after the onset of the Iraq War. And obviously hasn't gone back in. And those are basically the five. South Sudan hasn't joined the treaty, but not because they're about to build a nuclear weapon. Iran has been a party to this treaty, since the very beginning. And as part of the treaty, Iran has been undergoing these inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They obviously had extra sort of requirements on them after the JCPOA, and it was only after the 12-day war of last year that they sort of, cut some of those ties, inspections, didn't, but it's sort of hard to blame them, after they were, in some sense, both last year and this year, they were in the middle of negotiations when they were attacked. But I want to say one other thing about Israel. So I really don't understand the Samson option. So I'm going to pass on that one, just because I don't want to say things that aren't right. And I've read and heard a lot about it, but I feel like a lot of it is interpretation and some of it is speculation, and I don't want to say things that I don't feel I understand deeply. I do want to say that there has been an effort for decades, and in fact, since 1974, when Iran and Egypt sort of put forth this idea that the Middle East would have a weapons of mass destruction free zone. And such zones actually exist in several parts of the world. At the time, I think it was just Latin America and the Caribbean. That was the very first nuclear weapons free zone. There's also one in the South Pacific. And then Iran and Egypt, knowing, I'm sure, by that time that Israel had nuclear weapons, really wanted to turn the Middle East into a nuclear weapons free zone. This became a very big issue in 1995. 1995 was kind of a big year. I mean, this was end of the Cold War. We could have done so much more. This was talk about missed opportunities. But in 1995 was the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, 50th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so on. It was also the 25th anniversary of the entry into force of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that year, a review conference was held for the treaty here in New York City. And what they needed to do was to make some decision about the future of the treaty. And they ended up deciding to extend it indefinitely. I should just say generally about the treaty that the treaty has sort of these three pillars, which are, on the one hand, states promising not to acquire nuclear weapons. So that's the non-proliferation part of it. On the other hand, states that have nuclear technologies helping other states to acquire nuclear technologies for peaceful purposes. And the third pillar is that the states that had nuclear weapons up to that point, and those were the five recognized ones were United States, Soviet Union, now Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. They were under an obligation to negotiate in good faith towards total and complete disarmament. So that treaty, one could in general say that it's been successful on the non-proliferation front. One can also say that it's been successful, whatever one thinks of nuclear energy, successful in sort of nuclear energy being, in our world and countries that wanted being able to acquire it. And one could also say that it's failed miserably on the disarmament front, because clearly, we're in a far worse position than we were even at the end of the 1960s. But at that conference where they decide to extend the treaty indefinitely, which is kind of, again, is sort of along this theme of, they're never going to disarm. They'll just keep kicking the can down the road. This issue of the Middle East was a really big issue. And so there was basically a resolution that was passed, to work on this Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction. And we are now, more than 30 years past that resolution. There's been very little progress. There have been regular conferences over the last several years at the United Nations on this. Israel doesn't come, and the United States basically also doesn't come. And so all these other countries in the Middle East really want, here you keep accusing Iran, and Iran saying, no, we want a zone free of nuclear weapons in our entire region. There are also, people are concerned that Saudi Arabia could have enough, their nuclear technologies could be advanced enough to develop a nuclear weapon. But they all want to be part of this zone, and it's really Israel that's standing in the way. And the one that actually has nuclear warheads. The standard number that's cited for Israel is 90 nuclear warheads, and many some experts say that it might be as high as 300 or 400.
Well, Ivana, before we get into our last topic of what can be done, what we could look forward to as far as opportunities for disarmament or to support that kind of work, where should people look for you online?
So I am. My role kind of in nuclear disarmament is I serve as president of the NuclearAgePeace Foundation. So they can definitely look up our website, wagingpeace.org. We have a new Substack called Nuclear Insanity that, recalls some of the comments I made earlier. Social media. I have a personal account on X. I'm not very good at it, but you can see some of what I'm doing. I do tend to write a lot of op-eds, and most of those will appear in that Substack. So that's a good place to see what I'm up to.
Okay, we'll put some links in the description for everyone to check out. And finally,
Right.
what can we do? And people often ask, what can I do? Also, what can be done to support you?
So thank you. That's a really great question. I think for me, the very first thing is people need to be aware. People need to understand how serious this issue is. They need to understand what is at stake. They need to understand that we're not exaggerating, some of the things I've said. We have really good science. We have decades of, experience, to back all of this up. And we need to have a much better, much broader public understanding of the issues. That's number one. Number two is, and I sometimes get criticized when I offer these thoughts, but I think I still believe in democracy. I think that people need to let their elected officials know that this is an issue you care about. You don't have to insult President Trump, but just write him that you were deeply disturbed by his, threats to decimate a civilization. Write to your elected representatives that you'd like to see more support for social programs and infrastructure spending and whatnot here in the United States rather than for foreign wars. And most importantly, that when it comes to these nuclear weapons, let them know that you recognize them as a threat rather than as a solution to anything. And then just to get engaged, there are organizations like ours, and campaigns around the world and in the United States. It's not as widely discussed topic as it should be or as it once was. But part of that is just that we need more people to get involved. If there are local efforts in your community, and maybe there are efforts on climate change, and you can link some of this. One of the things that I worry about quite a bit is that climate change, for instance, is really making things more difficult in certain parts of the world, which is more likely to lead to conflict, which is more likely, right, to lead us to. So these things are very much related, and in some sense, I have a really fundamental belief that as long as we are basing the way in which we sort of interact with other countries, the way in which we treat other countries, if we're basing that on threats of annihilation, then our prospects for getting, for addressing some of the other global threats, whether they're related or not, of, global warming, AI, pandemics, falling birth rates, whatever it is that we sort of share in common and might want to work on together, isn't really going to get done as long as, our entire relationship is based on that, pointing a gun at your head. Even worse, right? Like, think of, having some problem in your neighborhood, and you have like, a ticking bomb that to bomb your neighbor's house. How likely is it that you and your neighbor are going to, solve that neighborhood problem together? So I think that, all of those, but in terms of kind of local organizations, following people on social media, watching, learning, and getting engaged in, there are also local efforts where, for example, we're part of multiple campaigns, but I'll just mention two of them. One is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. This is the campaign that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its efforts to bring about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which I discussed, and another campaign, which is a national campaign called Warheads to Windmills. So, when you contact congressional leaders, asking them to either initiate or support existing legislative efforts on related to nuclear weapons is obviously a good thing. Some of these campaigns also have kind of local initiatives. Back in the 80s, which was really the last time that we had a significant public movement against nuclear weapons, there were all kinds of, town resolutions. There are ways to bring this, declaring, for example, your town a nuclear weapons free zone. These are sort of maybe symbolic, but we sort of need to get to a much higher level of awareness, which we can do if people sort of mobilize, and address these issues. And then, there are people working on these issues. If there are opportunities to invite book authors, to give talks, or invite, if you're a teacher, invite someone to come speak at your school. Physicians, for example, there's a wonderful organization that we also work with closely called International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War. The idea was, again, back in the 80s, that, physicians can't respond to a nuclear attack, right, on their city. They can't help. They're not going to be. And so the only thing they can do is work towards prevention. So, again, I think we're really, in some sense, sadly, at kind of initial phases of still needing to raise awareness. But sometimes, things can happen very quickly also. Sometimes it takes a long time to sort of raise awareness, and then boom, we have historical examples of sort of things that were, thought to be impossible or miraculous actually happening. The end of the Cold War, the end of apartheid, fall of the Berlin Wall. Even if you go as far back as, as slavery, things that were once accepted then became not accepted. So, we've in some sense lived for 80 years with this acceptance of nuclear weapons, and we just need to get to a point where we no longer accept this kind of threat, this kind of prospect. Whether it's done in our names and done in the name of our security or not, it just should not be on the table.
Yes. Well, Dr. Ivana Nikolić Hughes, for raising that awareness with the work that you've been doing in media and things, on top of your duties as a professor at Columbia University, for exploring different strategies too. we didn't just talk about strict get rid of all the nuclear weapons today. We also talked about strategies to reduce that number to a number that wouldn't make us all go extinct and the practical advantages there. And for taking this interview with me, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brad. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching my interview. To go even deeper on these ideas, you can watch my interview with Annie Jacobson, author of Nuclear War, A Scenario, using the link in the description or the box on the screen. And now, as promised, I'm going to pull one of these slips of paper from my hat.